for the invitation on your site. I have great respect for and love programmers and would like to start with that. It's a very good audience, and I'm glad to have a conversation with you here. First, I want to mention that the new chronology is a collaborative effort. I have co-authors, Gleb Nasovsky and Tatiana Fomenko, my wife. That's the first thing. Secondly, a lot of information about the new chronology is available on our official website, chronologia.org. If you search our names on the internet, our website will appear in the first line. All our books, texts, illustrations are freely available there. All research on the new chronology, critiques, discussions, questions, and answers are presented there. Therefore, I highly recommend listeners to refer to this website. Now, to the substance of your question, Yegor. What is the new chronology? It is a new scientific field that I started quite a while ago, in 1977, and then it was developed jointly with colleagues. Methods for processing literary sources, chronicles, and chronologies were developed. Chronology is a branch of applied mathematics. During the research, it unexpectedly became clear that the currently accepted chronology, seemingly, is incorrect. There are significant errors in it. The methods were aimed at developing a new chronology to understand which dates correspond to the ancient sources. A certain science emerged, and it turned out that there are shifts in chronology. Much research has been carried out that continues to this day. This is what the new chronology is.
Tell me, why should this be important to us? Why should people living today care about events from the 13th to the 15th century?
Here's why. In reality, the history of antiquity and the Middle Ages is the foundation of our perceptions not only of our past but also of our present. The thing is, that many of our ideas are formed and rely precisely on dates. Dates are the backbone of chronology, the backbone of history, the backbone of our perception, the backbone of our understanding of the past, of our ancestors. It has always been considered advantageous to stand on the shoulders of an ancient lineage. This is considered very respectful. Our ideas about the history of civilization, the history of weapons, the history of clothing, the history of climate change, to name a few, are based on dates. Climate predictions for the future are made based on chronology. Therefore, climate data supposedly from the 15th to the 17th centuries and even earlier are used. So, if our perceptions of the past are erroneous, it significantly affects our understanding of the present.
Don't you think there's a lot of politics in this? That the way we see history, especially deep history, can be a weapon in the hands of those who influence today's politics?
Certainly. Unfortunately, history is closely intertwined with politics. It's a significant problem. Unlike history, in mathematics and physics we are free from politics. We can create based purely on logic. History, unfortunately, is sometimes entangled with politics. We see this, for example, in recent events after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In all the newly independent republics, a new history is being written. It is rewritten anew. The perception of the Soviet Union disappears altogether. New concepts are put forward. In school textbooks, they write that. I won't give specific vivid examples, but we all see this today. It affects our perception not only of the past but also of the present. And apparently, something similar happened not so long ago, in the Middle Ages. We witnessed the collapse of the USSR, how new dynasties emerged from its fragments, creating their own history. Something similar, apparently, happened in the 17th century when a large empire, the Great Russo-Horde Empire, was splitting. After the provinces broke away, the process of rewriting history also began. Therefore, the perception of the past is very important. Unfortunately, it's all intertwined with politics.
A question from many readers. I informed them that we would have an interview, and several people asked me the same interesting question. They ask, how did you start doing this? What prompted you? That's their question. Now my question is, how did it happen that you, being a mathematician, not a historian, and working in mathematics for which you were paid, engaged in something alternative? How did this happen?
Naturally, I was and remain a mathematician. Somewhere around 1975-1976, I was involved in celestial mechanics. Specifically, I became aware of the work of the remarkable scientist Robert Newton, who investigated the acceleration of the moon. This was needed for calculating satellite trajectories, for creating global positioning system for ships and airplanes. Based on eclipse descriptions, he determined the historical acceleration of the moon. He plotted how the acceleration changed from our time into the distant past. It turned out that from our time until the 11th century, it was more or less constant. Then a strange leap by an order of magnitude happened, followed by some chaos. A problem arose in celestial mechanics, a purely mathematical and physical in nature. In the existing theory of gravity for the Earth-Moon system, such an extraordinary leap could not be explained. The moon cannot move so unusually. In England, there was even a conference on this topic. Many scientists studied this effect. The question remained poised in mid-air, and there was no answer. It was suggested that, apparently, in the Earth-Moon system, there are mysterious non-gravitational forces that cause such an extraordinary leap in the acceleration of the moon. I became interested in this issue because I was involved in celestial mechanics. It was a very striking effect, and I started to investigate it. I noticed that, unlike the commentators who were working on this, no one paid attention to the fact that Newton's research relied on eclipse dates that were distributed from our time supposedly down to the 5th century BC. Eclipse dates are something outside of realm of physics. It is chronology. It is history. Then I remembered that there was a remarkable Russian scientist and encyclopedist, Nikolai Morozov. He conducted research on chronology and wrote a 7-volume work titled Christ. He claimed that there were significant errors in chronology and proposed certain shifts. He studied eclipses and found that, upon careful analysis, eclipses needed to be redated, and the dates had to be moved closer to our time, not by a year or two, but sometimes by hundreds or even thousands of years. Naturally, I was not interested in history, but nevertheless decided to look at his tables, examine the dates he provided for supposedly ancient eclipses, and input them into Newton's algorithm. I recalculated the acceleration of the moon and unexpectedly discovered that the leap disappeared, the mystery disappeared, there was no gap. The acceleration of the moon, as it is today, remained more or less constant back to the past for which eclipse dates existed. In other words, I solved a purely mathematical problem related to celestial mechanics. But then the question arose, who was right? Because the date shifts proposed for the eclipses were very significant. It was not so simple to say that the eclipse in the history of Thucydides is dated not to the 5th century BC but to the 12th century AD. I approached our historians at Moscow State University, went to the history department, and said that something strange was happening. Astronomy dictates a shift in eclipse dates, eliminating a certain extraordinary and strange effect. At the same time, we understand that one cannot simply change chronology. How would you, historians, comment on this? Historians told me the following. Yes, we've heard about Morozov. He was a strange person, engaging in nonsense. So, you, a young, active, successful mathematician, forget that name. All in all, mathematicians are better off doing mathematics, and historians, history. We wish you success and all the best. I understood that unfortunately, I didn't get an answer. But the question was interesting. Who is right, astronomers or historians? That was the beginning of my interests and research in chronology. Later, colleagues joined, and since then, we have been working on this together.
How did you manage to convince your superiors that it's worth doing this? Or you didn't convince them? Did you do this in your free time?
No, I didn't convince my superiors. We did this in our free time. It's, of course, a very large, immense work. It's like a part of my life, maybe a third or half. But it's a purely scientific question. For scientific pursuits, you don't need to convince your superiors that something is interesting. When we started doing this, it turned out that this topic interests thousands of people. When we began publishing books, there were thousands of comments, a lot of interest. So, there is interest in society. Society is interested in true history.
And if a student came to you now, for example, and said that he had some idea that you consider useless and wrong, but he is interested in it. Moreover, he has some readers who are also interested in it. And he wants to pursue this and spend half of his time on it, not on the dissertation that you supervise, but on some topic that he needs. How would you react to that?
The question of usefulness has never interested me. We are scientists, and we are interested in scientific truth, correct or incorrect, truth or misconception. Whether it's useful or not is a purely political question. It may be useful to someone or not. Science does not operate with the category of usefulness. If a question is interesting from a scientific point of view, then one should pursue it.
How do you feel about the criticism surrounding the new chronology? I'll tell you that personally, I often find it even more interesting to read critiques of your works because, in the tone they use in their papers, in their critical articles, and in the arguments they present, I can easily sense that it deeply affects them. And if it affects them, it means you're doing something meaningful, something that contradicts their beliefs, and therefore, it's important. It has scientific value in the search for truth. What is your attitude toward this? Do you also take it in stride, or do you find it unpleasant to read criticism?
You are absolutely right that unfortunately, most critics are irritated, and it affects them personally. Our approach is as follows. We examine what is available to us, critical publications on the internet. Occasionally, we also review discussions on television where our work has been discussed. Primarily, our interest lies in the scientific questions. If we come across arguments that, at least formally, resemble scientific activity, we investigate them. We write responses, and on our website, there is a dedicated section for criticism, where we publish our responses. It is a useful practice, even though there are very few such statements. I'll say straight that they have not influenced the overall concept. As mathematicians, we insist that our methods have been evaluated. Our main results, which we have obtained, can be rechecked by any interested specialist, be it a mathematician, physicist, chemist, or programmer. Therefore, if there are any reasonable and useful remarks, we take them into account. However, there have been very few of such remarks. I repeat, it has not affected the overall concept. Unfortunately, a significant portion of negative criticism is emotional, crude, and irritated. It does not interest us. Of course, it can be bothersome at times, especially when very unpleasant terms are used. However, our interest in it quickly wanes. Therefore, our attitude toward criticism is quite calm. The main thing we insist on is that we have methods. Based on them, a new scheme, a new chronology, a new system of dates has been constructed. Of this, we are sure. Anyone interested can verify it. We reasoned that we would first calculate new dates, and then historians would join us in figuring out what the real history was. Unfortunately, historians have not fully engaged in this yet. There are many young historians in contact with us, and they really help us. However, they ask not to mention their names because they work in teams where there are senior colleagues. Senior colleagues mostly have a very negative attitude towards the new chronology. Therefore, young generation try to communicate with us incognito. We found that, unfortunately, the expectations that historians would create a new history based on our dates did not materialize. We started doing it ourselves in our free time and created a system of hypotheses. The reconstruction that many are aware of is a hypothetical system. We proposed a certain scheme of events that aligns with the dates we found. The new chronology emerged, its second part, a certain reconstruction. Most of the criticism is directed mainly at the reconstruction. Since people look at our conclusions, they are often astonished and irritated. However, we would be very interested in discussing our methods and calculations. In our opinion, this is more productive. Therefore, a conversation with programmers is always very important for us. On our website, we have posted the programs we use. We invite anyone interested to take these programs or create their own and verify our conclusions. This would be interesting for us. The main basis of the new chronology is the so-called global chronological map. It was constructed based on the analysis of datings in our modern history textbooks, using a system that was created in the 16th–17th centuries. Modern textbooks are also based on this system. By applying our methods, it was discovered that this textbook contains 4 layers, 4 shorter chronicles that are very similar to each other. They practically identical. The current textbook on ancient history was made as follows. You take 4 instances of the shorter chronicle and glue them together not in the way it should be, by placing them on top of each other, but with certain time shifts. The shift values are significant: 300 years, 1000 years, 1700 years. By gluing the 4 chronicles, we get a long chronicle. This is the basis of the modern history textbook on ancient and medieval history. This is the fact we discovered, and we insist on it. Everything else in the reconstruction is hypotheses. There is room for debates and discussions now and in the future.
On this, I agree with you, because most of the critics of the new chronology that I have read, in my opinion, are trying to cling to some specific facts or individual assumptions in your reconstruction. And then, clinging to them, they attempt to dismantle the entire theory. Extracting a particular fact or quote from your text, they refute it. How do they refute it? They claim that in such and such a book, something contradictory is stated, supported by some experiments, researches, archaeology, and so on. And since you made a mistake in this specific phrase, it means your entire theory is incorrect. I thought that perhaps you also approach your work not as mere fact-finding, archaeological work, or the classification of micro-events and placing them on a map, but rather as the definition of a certain direction in historical science, indicating where we should be heading. And as you rightly said, historians will come after this and begin to develop it further, clothing it in a more reliable picture and substantiating it with facts that they could gather themselves as historians. Perhaps I am correct in this, or do you see it differently?
Absolutely right. That's what I was saying. This is a completely correct point of view. There are methods for calculating dates. I repeat once again, that chronology is a branch of applied mathematics. It's a complex matter. Firstly, there's the dating of eclipses, which involves astronomy, algorithms, and programs that calculate the positions of the moon and the sun, something that needs to be studied. It's somewhat non-obvious at the initial stages. Then, the issue of chronology involves the interrelation of different calendars. In the past, different calendars were used, and one has to be able to recompute them. This is also a very challenging activity. The issue of ancient calendars is applied mathematics. There were several cyclical counters, and dates were recorded not with 1 but with 3 numbers. Converting them to modern dating is a non-trivial problem in combinatorics. All of this also needs to be studied. Next, we developed methods for studying ancient texts. It involves analyzing the duration of reigns, the frequency of name usage, and the frequency of references. This is also necessary for dating. It's not an obvious thing. Unfortunately, at the moment, only mathematicians, physicists, and chemists possess this knowledge. We offered our historians at the History faculty of Moscow State University to teach courses on chronology, on methods of chronology, on methods of applied mathematics. Unfortunately, this has not been implemented yet. But it's impossible to engage in chronology without mastering certain methods, as I mentioned. Unfortunately, today, from the historian's perspective, chronology is something that was established long ago. They study it in school and university as a kind of table, memorizing dates by heart. However, we question where these dates came from. It turns out that these dates are often incorrect. That's what needs to be addressed. Once the backbone of dates is established, sources, names, emperors' biographies, wars need to be added to it. But everything depends on the dates. When you change the dates, everything changes. Dates are the backbone of chronology.
I understand that when you started doing this, you based your method on mathematics, meaning calculations, a lot of calculations. If I understand correctly, you use a mechanism of comparison, patterns, or templates that occur in history and try to find similarities between them. If a similarity is found, then you attempt to consolidate them, which allows cutting out a significant historical chunk from the chronology and thus aligning events of the past with events from ancient times. This is how I understand it. When I first learned about you, I had a question. In those years when computers were still in their infancy, how did you manage the volume of calculations?
It was a very extensive undertaking. Indeed, at the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics of Moscow State University, we had certain computing facilities at our disposal that we used. However, a significant part of the work involved processing sources. It was necessary to compile the durations of rulers' reigns. To determine whether certain dynasties were similar or dissimilar, a substantial list of the durations of reigns needed to be created. For this purpose, chronology tables published up to the 19th century were used. Extracting data from them was a massive task. Then, lists of names and the frequency of name mentions in texts, such as the Bible, had to be compiled. The Bible is divided into chapters. Tables were created to show in which chapters of the Bible certain names were used. This work was done in part by my parents. It was a huge project spanning several years. The Bible was also processed to create cross-references within it, linking one book to another. Today, this could be done with the help of computers, but back then, it was more challenging. Undoubtedly, it was a massive effort that took time, and our colleagues assisted us. It was not a matter of months or a single year. It lasted for several years. Then, of course, it was necessary to process written and literary sources, chronicles. This was a very labor-intensive task. In particular, the Bible and Talmud were studied. I can name some texts that needed to be analyzed in order to construct a correct chronology. For example, the Bible, both the Old and New Testaments, Talmud, Torah, New Testament Apocrypha, Quran, the famous American Book of Mormons, and the sacred narrative of the American people Popol Vuh. Herodotus, Livy, Claudius Ptolemy, Homer, Suetonius, Cornelius Tacitus, and so on. Ovid, Strabo, Josephus Flavius, Appian of Alexandria, the Indian Mahabharata. This involves a vast amount of text. Names, frequencies, and references had to be extracted from them. Then, the method of form codes was developed. Special forms were filled out for the main rulers in the dynasty. A form was prepared for each of them, consisting of several dozen fields. It was filled out using ancient sources. Information such as year of birth and birth circumstances, ascension to the throne, wars, unrests, adversaries, allies, etc., was included. Were there any eclipses during his reign or not? It involved a very extensive, drafty, and routine task. But, unfortunately, without it, creating a chronology would have been impossible.
Listening to all this and being to some extent an artificial intelligence specialist, I think that nowadays, in the rapidly advancing era of artificial intelligence, all this data could potentially be utilized by some form of artificial intelligence. Using your methods, it could perform this work much faster, or it could do even more. It might offer new conclusions. Perhaps, it makes sense for young mathematicians, historians, and programmers to engage in this now?
Well, of course, that's a kind of program. We would be glad if someone joined us. Moreover, there are now methods that were not available to us. Naturally, we did not process everything from the ancient sources. Nowadays, much is available on the internet. Many texts are digitized and can be processed much faster than we did in our time. Of course, it's an appeal that I fully support and always promote. This is an appeal to young people with interests, tastes, and abilities in computer text processing, algorithm research, and methods. Chronology is a vast and interesting field of activity. And, I repeat, it is inherently interesting to society. People who engage in chronology will develop our methods and will be at the center of societal interest.
Let me share a story from my personal folklore. A couple of years ago, I was on a tour of the historical Moscow, in the center of Moscow. There were a few of us, and we had a guide who told us where each church was built, where each wall was laid, and in which years all this happened. And somewhere in the middle of the tour, recalling your lectures, your work, I asked the guide a question. There are people, Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky, and they have their own version of what happened here. The guide told me that if I mentioned the names of these people on our tour, he would not continue the tour. I laughed at that time, and in general, we couldn't establish a dialogue. Somehow, they don't want to hear what you propose. Again, this only confirms the suspicion that it apparently bothers them more than just heresy. It's like if, for example, I wrote a book on differential geometry and put some nonsense in it because I am not a specialist in it. If I wrote something that completely contradicted science, would you, for example, write a refutation of this book? Of course not. You would walk by and probably wouldn't even pay attention to it. But if I wrote something that seriously challenged your understanding of geometry, and if you started to refute it, then it means I said something really important. Such a folk story once again confirmed my opinion. Why am I telling this? I want to ask. Right now, for example, students who are watching us might think that it's really an interesting topic. Huge databases are now available on the internet. The Quran, the Bible, and all of this is now open for public. If in 1978 or in the 1980s you had to process all this manually, now it's already available in digital form. Indeed, you can take huge texts, digitize them, or they are already digitized, analyze them, find the necessary words, their frequency of repetitions, group them, find some classification. And the student might think, if I start doing this, I will find something alternative. I will make conclusions that do not correspond to the conclusions of classical history, and I will have a life like Anatoly Fomenko's. Do I need such a life? In general, do people need to engage in alternative sciences? Let's broaden this question a bit more. Do young students or young scientists, in general, need to go against classical science?
Essentially, the answer is positive. But, as you appropriately said, and I've mentioned this before, young people face a problem. Many, including historians, are interested in our research but are afraid of the reaction from the older generation, which is more conservative and resistant to change. Therefore, my advice is as follows. One may engage in chronology while having a certain profession, like mine, mathematics, physics, or chemistry. A person who possesses logic, the tools of mathematics, physics, and astronomy, has an independent sphere of activity. Chronology can be recommended as a secondary activity. Because dedicating one's entire life to studying chronology, unfortunately, in our time is fraught with problems for young people. I would not advise building one's entire life on creating alternative history. By the way, this is evident from what you mentioned, the reaction during excursions. In the 1990s, when our book started being published, and there were already many on this topic, there was a very strong reaction in society. Society, and primarily historians, realized that there is indeed a very big problem with chronology. The issue of chronology became quite painful for them. But it's hard to figure it out. I mentioned that it is still a branch of applied mathematics, and the key is dates. For historians, dealing with it is unfortunately not easy, although we constantly offer collaboration with them. Therefore, a certain path has been chosen, which, in my opinion, is incorrect. It is an attempt to silence our research and react to it very critically and oversensitively. Regarding excursions, we know that mentioning our names usually causes irritation among guides. The question of chronology is sensitive for a large group of people. When you visit a museum or attend a lecture and ask neutral questions like, "What color was Julius Caesar's hair?" they will gladly tell you. But when you ask a question like, "Why did he live, let's say, in the 1st century BC?" it causes irritation. In a softer response, you might hear, "Consult a textbook, read it." When you reply that you've read it but still have questions and would like a more detailed answer, it provokes annoyance. This annoyed reaction is towards our research. Unfortunately, this is still the case, and it has to be overcome. Our hope is that the younger generation will delve deeper into this. Since the topic is very relevant, interesting, and captivating, we hope the offended reaction will diminish.
One of the conclusions from your methods is that Ivan the Terrible is a figure composed by historians significantly later than his life. More precisely, not his life, but the lives of several people were merged into a single character presented to us as Ivan the Terrible. When people accustomed to studying history from textbooks hear this, it probably bothers them because you are challenging some of their cultural identity. They may feel that you are taking away something very valuable to them, namely, the belief in certain historical events associated with their homeland and country, and so on. Perhaps this is a significant aspect?
Of course, from childhood, in school and then in university we were taught history, about the events that took place. There are very vivid stories, like the 300 Spartans tragically perishing, defending Greece from the invasion of barbarians, long before the Common Era. It's all very glorious, captivating, and it shapes our perception of history, becoming ingrained in us. It's very challenging to let it go. I remember my own reaction and the reaction of my colleagues when we started this work, engaging in calculations, astronomy. We had no idea where it would lead us. I remember my reaction. Yes, it's very difficult to let go of many things. Unfortunately, we have to live with it and somehow break through it. I repeat, the main thing is the dates. For example, let's take the history of ancient Egypt. I want to briefly illustrate an example that demonstrates that dates actually make up the entire backbone of history, not reasoning about who resembles whom or what color the hair of someone was. Here is the history of ancient Egypt. Long before our time, in the 19th and 20th centuries, Egyptologists discovered many zodiacs in Egypt. A zodiac is a scheme depicting the arrangement of planets in constellations, portrayed on the wall of a temple in Egypt, on the ceiling, or sometimes on the lid of a coffin. There are zodiac constellations and 7 planets are placed on them. This is a clock. Since the planets move through constellations at different speeds, we have a clock face. There are 12 sectors on the clock face, which are the constellations of the zodiac, and 7 clock hands that move across the clock face at different speeds. Each position of the planets is a certain date. This is something that can be calculated today. There are now well-known calculation programs, and they allow us to determine in which year in the past a particular position of planets occurred in the zodiac. This is the zodiac or horoscope. There are many such images in Egypt, a few dozens of them. Very interesting dates were obtained. What was going on before our work, before Morozov's work? In general, the first person to raise the question of chronology was Nikolai Morozov. He was the first to discover shifts in chronology and the first to understand that history must be revised. He also started with dating of zodiacs and found that the dates assigned to the Egyptian zodiacs in today's textbooks are actually incorrect. They had to be moved upward, closer to our time, sometimes by hundreds of years. After that, a strange situation arose. Egyptologists are aware of Morozov's work. Those who tried to date these zodiacs before him did not find the necessary dates in the past. They began to adjust the data, claiming that the position of Venus in a particular zodiac is incorrectly depicted. It's not in Taurus but in Libra, for example. In other words, they manipulated the data. If you reject this practice and date what is actually drawn, what Morozov started with, and what we continued doing, then completely different dates appear. I want to give a few examples, name some names. We processed several dozen zodiacs. For example, the well-known Metternich stela, zodiacs in the tomb of Ramesses IV, Ramesses IX in Egypt, the rectangular Dendera zodiac, which is a huge temple in Egypt with a very large zodiac on its ceiling, the arrangement of planets and constellations. The zodiac of Ramesses VII, 2 zodiacs in Athribis. The zodiac of the famous pharaoh Seti I. The zodiac of Ramesses VI, and so on. All these zodiacs in modern textbooks are attributed to the deepest past, hundreds and thousands of years before the Common Era. However, in reality, all these dates are situated from the 10th century of the Common Era onwards, up to the 19th century. The famous Brooks zodiacs on the tomb, supposedly dating back to the beginning of the Common Era, were made in the early 19th century. In Egypt, until the 19th century, coffins were painted according to ancient tradition, thus marking the burial dates. This is the effect of shifting dozens of dates in the history of Egypt from the deepest past to the era from the 10th century to the 19th century. Certainly, even without being mathematicians, everyone understands that such a shift is impossible without a radical revision of the history of ancient Egypt. But the history of Egypt is intertwined with other histories. The history of Europe, the history of the Middle East. Again, it is impossible to pull out only the history of Egypt and raise it up. Everything needs to be changed. This also irritates people when they look at the conclusions. We suggest looking at the root of data, at the dates, at the methods, at astronomy, at astrology. These are our recommendations.
If we take other sciences, not just chronology, not just history, but for instance, programming or some applied engineering sciences, there are also certain fundamental beliefs that have long existed and certain practices that have long been accepted by all, such as how to program and how not to program. There are people trying to oppose this, come up with something of their own, and change the foundation on which we all stand for 30 to 40 consecutive years. History is much older, but programming is a very young science, only a few decades old. There are views. There are people who try to knock out this foundation from under the feet of all programmers, and they get roughly the same reaction that you get from historians. What would you recommend to these people? Should they give up this pursuit and do what everyone else is doing, or should they continue with their alternative approach?
No, the answer is unequivocal. Under no circumstances should you give up. This is a scientific subject. One must engage in science regardless of whether you start swimming against the current. Of course, it is very exhausting, and skeptics say that you can swim against the current, but you will soon get tired, and you will be carried away. But my recommendation, you still have to swim. I want to say that you asked a good question. History is not the only science where such a situation has arisen. Why go far? In the history of mathematics, there is the famous fifth postulate of Euclid, the parallel postulate. It is studied in schools. Quite a long time ago, mathematicians began to think, is it true or not? Is there an alternative geometry? Different people took up this task. In the 19th century, our famous mathematician Nikolai Lobachevsky created non-Euclidean geometry. Since then, it has been called Lobachevskian geometry. It is based on changing this postulate to another form of the axiom about parallel lines. In those years, this was perceived very nervously, very irritably. He was accused of inventing some fantasy that has nothing to do with mathematics or reality. He faced a lot of accusations. Moreover, there were people who, by upbringing and education, were most closely related to this. For example, the famous mathematician Gauss discovered something from this new geometry himself but was afraid to speak out publicly, fearing, as he wrote in letters, that he would be accused of fantasies. But later, over time, it became clear that Lobachevsky was right. There are many geometries. One is Euclidean geometry. Another is the new hyperbolic geometry of Lobachevsky. In mathematics, such an example of breaking with established beliefs was known, and it was successfully overcome. In physics, the same thing happened. The theory of relativity, the reaction to the works of Hilbert, Minkowski, and Einstein, was also initially sharply negative and scandalous because it supposedly contradicted the notions of Newtonian physics. But in physics, this was also overcome, and a new wonderful science emerged, the theory of relativity, both special and general relativity. Here, an interesting effect is evident. Why did these revolutions occur earlier in mathematics and physics? Because these sciences are, in a sense, simpler than history. History is more complex than physics and mathematics. In mathematics, we must master a set of axioms and logic. You prove theorems if you are able to prove good theorems. The volume of information to be absorbed here is still small. History is more complicated. There is a very large volume of primary sources. You need to know a lot and process a lot. Therefore, the revolution comes later here. The first such signal was the work of the remarkable scholar Morozov. Since, as I repeat, the science of history is more cumbersome, more complex, and requires a mass of primary sources, the revolution is delayed here. But apparently, the time has come, and it is happening. Morozov's work, our work. This is what happened earlier in mathematics, the work of Lobachevsky, or in physics, the works of Hilbert, Minkowski, Einstein. And then in history. This is a natural process. One should treat it quite naturally and even be pleased that some new knowledge is emerging that opens up a lot to us about our past.
You know, it opens up for someone, but for someone, it is a danger. In many countries, including European countries and our country, there are legislative acts prohibiting the revision of history. You have probably heard about this. They currently concern recent events, such as the Second World War, events of the 20th century. But they do not yet concern events from the 13th century. No one forbids us to revise the history of Ivan the Terrible's life. But perhaps the state will eventually go further and prohibit even this, prohibit any revision of history altogether, and say that history is something frozen, fixed, carved in stone, and should not be touched. There was Ivan the Terrible, hence he existed. We said it once, and there's no need to go back to it. Aren't you afraid that this might happen?
I hope it won't be the case. Of course, there is such a possibility. But I think that reasonable people interested in the proper development of society will not allow it.
Why do you think those people who do not accept these changes, did not accept Lobachevsky, did not accept Einstein, do not accept you and Gleb Nosovsky? What motivates them primarily? Are they afraid of losing their job? Afraid for the value of their work? What drives them first and foremost?
Certainly, it's the fear for their current lives. In connection with this, I want to recall one of the reviews of Morozov's works when he published his remarkable work titled, Christ. By the way, the title Christ was not given by him but was insisted upon by historians who protested against the original title that Morozov gave to the work. The original title was, The History of Human Culture in Natural Light. When his work was published, there was a very sharp reaction from historians, and there were many accusations against Morozov. One of the commentators who raised exactly this question asked, why such a sharp reaction to Morozov's research? He said, well, imagine that you are a historian, that you have spent your whole life studying ancient Rome. You live in a kind of, as Morozov claimed, fairy tale world. And someone tells you that you have to take a certain step. What step? You hear the terrifying word, reconsider. Not reconsider one article, reconsider your entire life, which began as a student, then a graduate student, a PhD, a professor, an academician. You cannot reconsider. This word is terrifying. In this lies the irritated, nervous, offended reaction of many people who have achieved much in their respective fields. Unfortunately, today we see the following picture. In the 17th century, a certain version of history, a version of chronology was created. We know who created it, the famous chronologists of the Middle Ages, Petavius and Scaliger. A certain world was created. In our opinion, it is erroneous. Another question is, why they created it. This is an interesting matter, and we can discuss it as well. For now, let's note that in our view, the world they created is erroneous in terms of dates. A fantastical, richly populated picture emerged, where thousands of characters are distributed. Julius Caesar, Jesus Christ, Ivan the Terrible, and others. People have grown up with this, thinking that they are swimming in this world as in the world of reality. From our perspective, this is a mistake. It's a kind of phantom, a mirage. Realizing that you have lived your life in a mirage is a terrifying thing.
Yes, undoubtedly, one can imagine how this irritates them. What do you think? Could people also be annoyed by the fact that a revision of history affects the concept of the state and the individual's connection with the state, introducing a certain pride in the state? For example, in one of your works, you argue that the Mongol-Tatar yoke is largely the result of historians' fabrications, and events unfolded differently. There were no Tatars or Mongols there. More precisely, there were Tatars, but no Mongol hordes on that territory. This changes people's perception of their state. Many believe, for example, as I have heard, that your work, in many ways, is such. This is about conversations with foreigners. I spent several years in the USA, and there I also tried to talk about your theory. All the time it didn't elicit irritation but a smile, because your theory largely improves the history of the Russian state. It adds more nobility to the state, changes the image of the state that suffered under the heel of certain invaders and paints a more honorable and dignified picture. When I told them about this, they smiled and said, well, they are probably Russian scientists? I said, yes, Russian. And then our dialogue didn't go any further. What can you say about this? I will formulate the question. Do you consider yourself a patriot of our country? Did this in any way motivate your research? Or are the two unrelated?
Of course, I am a patriot of Russia, but it has absolutely nothing to do with our research in mathematics. What I talked about, the creation of the new chronology, is about calculating dates. There is no nationalism in date calculations. I repeat, anyone interested can verify and obtain our new dates. There is certainly no nationalism in the calculation of the dates of ancient Egyptian zodiacs, which I mentioned, and the shift of these zodiacs from the deepest past to the Middle Ages, starting from the 10th century and beyond, up to the 19th century. It's a matter of calculation, astronomy, and mathematics. I repeat, what emerged is the result of applying our methods, which we insist on. The unexpected result for us was that the history of various civilizations was equalized. We are accustomed to the idea that there are young civilizations. Russia, the Balkans. There are more ancient civilizations, France, Germany. There are monstrously ancient civilizations, Greece, Egypt, and even more ancient ones, like Sumer and so on. This is about chronology, about dates. Dates change, everything changes. Of course, for an average foreigner, it might be strange to hear that the history of ancient Egypt should be moved up. But again, we are not the first. The smiles you saw were also directed at the works of the great scientist Isaac Newton. We are not the first. Not even Morozov was the first to raise the question that the old dates were incorrect. The great scientist, physicist, and mathematician Isaac Newton spent many years researching chronology. He approached it as a scientist. He examined the dates of some eclipses and noticed that with careful dating, the obtained dates were not the ones historians were providing, but closer to our time. Based on this, he formulated his version of chronology. It was raw, unfinished, fragmentary. Nevertheless, he wrote a book with an interesting title, The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended. Isaac Newton declared that the chronology of ancient Egypt and ancient Greece had to be changed. He compressed the history of Egypt into a 300-year interval and moved it up from the past by approximately 1500 years. He moved up by many hundreds of years many events in the history of ancient Greece, including the Trojan War. He wrote a book that caused a big scandal at the time. Some not very profound people began to laugh at him. And those same smiles that we saw towards us were on the faces of Newton's readers in his time. Unfortunately for them, it did not invalidate Newton's research. His book was removed from scientific circulation, silenced for many years, but it resurfaced. By the way, the Morozov's research and our research began when we were unaware of Newton's works. However, the conclusions obtained by Morozov and us, strangely enough, align with Newton's research. This is not strange. It means that the effect discovered by Newton, Morozov, and us, is a correct effect. It is objective, and it can be rechecked. Smiles. Yes. If in a conversation with a foreigner you say that the Trojan War was not in the 13th century BC but in the 13th century AD, then, of course, a person who knows nothing about chronology will express nothing but a smile on their face. Sure, it's a natural reaction. But, on the other hand, I want to say that, along with smiles, there is another reaction. Firstly, our 7-volume work and other books were translated into English. The 7-volume book is very popular. It is sold online, and there are many reviews, including positive ones among foreigners. There is also a completely negative reaction. The chief librarian of the United States made a statement that this theory created in Russia is chauvinistic. On this basis, as one of the library chiefs in the United States, he demanded that libraries remove our books from catalogs, both Russian and translated into English. Then an interesting effect occurred. We were curious about how the libraries in the United States reacted. It turned out that some libraries did comply and removed our books from catalogs, making them unavailable on the internet in the electronic catalog. But in most libraries where our books were, they remained. Because there, too, the reaction is ambiguous. There are smiles. There is an irritated cry to ban the books. And there is silent resistance. Books remain, and people read them.
You see, there is currently a stirring social issue. Should science be cautious about people's feelings? Can we publish all scientific research? Or are there certain research topics that we, as humanity, should acknowledge as unethical and never engage in? For instance, racial differences among people. You know that this topic is prohibited by UN conventions. No scientist would now study this topic if they want to be a scientist and want to be published. No article that examines, for example, racial differences among people will be accepted or considered, even if it's a purely scientific study conducted according to the scientific method and so on. And there are quite a few such topics. In your opinion, should the state or states block certain scientific topics? For example, topics like a revision of history, or, as the example I mentioned, the racial subjects. Or should science still be absolutely free in choosing lines of research?
I believe that scientific research should evolve independently and freely. The issue lies in where they are promoted. There should be no prohibitions on research in the scientific community. In the mainstream media, publications, on television, and in discussions, of course, there should be restrictions. Especially for sensitive issues, ethnic and racial subjects, and the like. That is natural. There should be no prohibitions in the scientific environment. Regarding chronology, we are in a better position than in the example you mentioned. The problem of dates is a mathematical one. There can be nothing offensive to people in reviewing and calculating dates. If there is a zodiac drawn on the ceiling of a temple, the question is, what date is this? The answer: you input these parameters into the program and get the result. Not the 5th century BC, but let's say, the 12th century AD. This is something that can be cross-checked, and it forms the backbone of chronology. It is a neutral matter. This should not offend or insult anyone. It is neither ethnic nor racial, nor emotional. There is no room for emotions, no room for belief. There is belief, and there is knowledge. Science is based on knowledge. Therefore, in my deep conviction, issues of dating are essentially emotionally neutral and should remain so.
I have one last question. Our programmers, who are listening to you, how could they help? Can you provide them with specific directions or perhaps specific instructions? Should they contact you? If people are interested in this topic and want to engage in it in their free time, as you recommended, on one hand, they will be programmers, continuing to develop their computer systems and getting paid for it. On the other hand, they have free time on weekends and would like to study the subject you have been working on for many years. What should they do?
We have a large list of zodiacs that we have discovered and that are not yet dated. Our proposal, for instance, we can provide these materials, and people, by exploring our methodologies, our programs, or by writing their own programs, can date these zodiacs. It will be a very interesting endeavor. There are many yet unprocessed zodiacs, not only in Egypt but also in Europe, in Italy, in Germany, in France. This material is very valuable and needs processing.
And for what purpose? What scientific question do we want to answer? What will it give us?
I mentioned one example. In the history of Egypt, you get shifts in chronology. We are forced to reconsider the history of Egypt. What we already know about the history of Italy is that many zodiacs depicted on the ceilings of villas and palaces in Italy, supposedly dating back to the 12th century, were actually created 150 to 200 years later, in the 15th-16th centuries. This calls into question the standard chronology of Italy, and it needs to be revisited. This is purely scientific and very interesting subject.
So, there are some zodiacs that you haven't deciphered yet, and when they are decoded, we will then shift some other history, change its position in time, right?
Yes, that would be interesting.
What about data analysis from the perspective of artificial intelligence? I understand that you haven't used such approaches yet, have you? Have you been operating with strict mathematical tools? Now there is artificial intelligence, and it is already second-generation artificial intelligence. It works on some unknown principles, into which, on the one hand, you can load a large amount of textual data, such as a description of a historical time slot or a description of historical texts, and then ask it a question about which historical interval this text belongs to, and it will give us an answer that is completely different from what we expected to hear from classical history. Perhaps, try using such methods too?
Certainly, that would be very interesting. We haven't dealt with that yet, but what you're talking about is a very interesting topic. It would be wonderful.
Yes, because such intelligence emerged just a year ago. Just last week, they celebrated ChatGPT's birthday. You've probably heard about this system that takes a large block of text and produces some outputs. And we often don't even understand where these outputs come from and how it generates them. If you were to train it with historical data,
it's a very interesting thing.
Okay. If, for example, someone is interested in this, could you provide some assistance?
Yes, of course. We are ready to share our materials, provide consultation, have a conversation, by all means. Whatever is needed from our side, we are ready to provide.
Great, thank you very much. I have run out of questions. It was very interesting for me. I hope the folks will find it intriguing. Thank you.
Thank you. All the best.
Goodbye.